Welcome to the RCAP USA Roundup, a podcast where we have real conversations affecting both cattle producers and beef consumers. We're your hosts, Jaden Moreland and
Karina Jones.
With that, let's get to today's episode. This episode is sponsored by Mason & Morse Ranch Company. Mason & Morse Real Estate Brokerage and Auction Services represents buying and selling farms, ranches, or recreational land across the United States. Hunting and fishing lands, equestrian estates, farmland, and cattle ranches are their passion, and they want to share experience and knowledge to help you make the right investment decisions. If you are considering buying a farm or ranch, or need professional marketing when you're ready to sell, experience is what counts. Their real estate agents offer clients more than 133 years of professional experience combined in buying, selling, and managing farms, ranches, and recreational properties. Their core values for cowboy ethics and authentic client relationships continue to be the foundation of Mason & Morse Ranch Company's professional land and ranch brokers services. Experienced, trusted, and committed, their team of agents will deliver exceptional service, and their marketing will showcase the stories and values behind America's greatest treasure, your farm, ranch, or recreational land. To learn more about Mason & Morse Ranch Company, visit ranchland.com. In today's world, monopolies reach into every fabric of our lives. In agriculture, we are all too familiar. But today, let's talk about the monopolies in almost every other industry too. What has happened to the strict antitrust laws and anti-monopoly behavior our country was founded upon? Where do we go from here? Join us as we discuss just that and more with Matt Stoller. Okay, well, Matt, welcome to the RCAP USA Roundup. We are excited to have you on today. So let's just kind of start with a general introduction. Tell us about yourself, where you're from, and what you do.
Yeah, my name is Matt Stoller. I am the Director of Research for the American Economic Liberties Project. I research and write about monopoly power. I also have a newsletter called Big, where I write about monopoly power.
Very cool. And so are you out of DC?
I'm in DC.
Okay, very cool.
Where all the good decisions are made.
So
You're
like
welcome, everyone. No.
So like you said, you're the Director of Research at the American Economic Liberties Project. So talk to us about what that is and what y'all do to those who aren't familiar.
Right. So yeah, we're a nonprofit, and it's about 20 of us. We focus on an area of law called antitrust law, which is focused on corporate consolidation and intended to address problems like mergers when companies corner a market by buying up their rivals, or contracting arrangements that reduce the power of small producers. And not just there are different agencies that enforce that kind of law, and then we focus more broadly on monopoly measures in general to make markets more fair and open and competitive. I'm sure that cattle ranchers know nothing about being on the other side of coercive contracting practices or mergers or anything like that. I'm sure that's completely new, completely foreign. We generally, where I'm being sarcastic, is, when you have to explain a joke, that means it's funny.
Yeah. I gotcha.
Yeah, no, and we focus on a lot of areas in the economy, not just so we focus on big tech like Google and Facebook and Amazon and Apple. We also look at areas like pharmaceuticals and middlemen in that realm. We look at institutions like Ticketmaster, Live Nation, and different parts of the government. And then I've written a little bit about how economists discuss cattle markets, which presumably is more relevant to what you guys do. But there are monopolies throughout our economy in really weird places. So I've also written up there's a monopoly in the cheerleading world. There are monopolies in mail sorting software. There are monopolies like all over the place, and they often are characterized in sort of the same way across industries, which a lot of people don't realize. There's usually an opaqueness of prices. There are usually exclusive deal contracting arrangements or forms of rebates. There's often cornering of the market through mergers. All of every industry is unique and has its own characteristics, its own art to it. But some of the tactics that you can use to corner a market are actually the same across the economy, and they're the same across history. A lot of this stuff, we've been through consolidation problems before in every industry, including meatpacking, and oil and whatnot. And we're going through a lot of the same problems today, which I can get into if you're interested.
Okay, I'm sure we will expand on those here in a bit. So, kind of let's back up. What is your background in antitrust and monopolies, and kind of what got you interested in these topics and enforcing antitrust, I guess?
Yeah, well, no, it's a long story, but you know, uh, I kind of never felt comfortable in with a sort of any political home. I was just working in a software company after college in the early 2000s, and then the Iraq War started, and I thought, uh, and a lot of the people that I respected thought that the war was a good idea, and so I thought that the war was a good idea, and it turns out it was a really bad idea. And that's what kind of got me to say, wait a second, something is wrong with our government, our media, and the way that we think about how to govern ourselves. And then so I got into politics because I got interested in that. And then I eventually wound up working in as a staffer in Congress for a member of Congress who was on the banking committee during the financial crisis. And we did a really bad job during that period of consolidating, there was a crisis that was caused by consolidation of banking power, and instead of reducing the concentration, we just decided, well, we like the concentration and we'll put a regulatory overlay on top of it. That's what our financial policy framework was. We're seeing it collapsing right now. And that I kind of like, I was thinking, why did my party do that? Like, the Democrats have traditionally considered themselves to be the party of the people. Why do we do that? And so it led me to kind of get interested in this dormant tradition of fighting monopolies. And I started to learn about chain stores in the 2010, 2011, 2012, and some of the rules that that the Democrats in the 30s had put up against chain stores. These rules lasted until the 1970s, and there are analogies in, I think, the meatpacking space, and why the Democratic Party in the 70s changed its approach to monopoly. And so I wrote a book about that. It's called Goliath: The 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy. It really helped me understand kind of why both parties shifted to kind of see small businesses as a bad thing instead of what the traditional American model, going back to the 1770s, you could go back to the 1600s if you want, in England. We had prioritized small businesses, the basis of an independent, self-governing citizenry. And we changed that notion in the 1970s and said, actually, small business is kind of inefficient. And what we want to do is put our faith in these like wizards or oracles called economists, who are scientists, and they're the people that should get to make decisions about how our commerce works. So I wrote this book, and because it really combined the consolidation, this puzzle, which was financial power's gotten much more concentrated, and then all other parts of the economy have gotten much more concentrated. And I wanted to understand why that was. So that's why I wrote that book. And then after I wrote that book, I've been working on trying to resurrect this dormant tradition and getting in both sides of the aisle, and getting more policymakers interested in what we really are facing today in America, which is a monopoly crisis. And we made a lot of progress. There was the Trump administration brought the first Department of Justice monopolization claim in 20 years. So they brought a claim against Microsoft in 1998, and then the Trump administration, they didn't bring one for 20 years. And the reason, as one top policymaker said, this is a crazy statement, but he actually said this was a guy who was an economist at the antitrust division. He said, well, we didn't bring any monopolization claims because there weren't any monopolies in the American economy. This was in like 2012 or something. It's like, oh my, like these are the people running things. And that's just crazy. And
Wow.
like he was a Democrat, but there were Republicans who agreed, right? I mean, that
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that's like insane. And how would you come to think about that? And he believes that. And he still, there are financial reasons for him to believe that, but he actually also believes in good faith. So trying to explain to people, okay, well, actually, there is this tradition of politics where we go after monopolies, and we should own that as an American as the American people. And so the Trump administration brought that suit. They also brought one against Facebook, and then the Biden administration has started to do a lot as well. They brought multiple cases against a whole bunch of different firms, including Google is another one. There are now 5 cases against Google. And I think that the USDA has started to do some things around beef markets. So made in USA, this is a voluntary labeling rule, but you can't, they just came out with, I think it was proposed rules on product of USA, which I'm sure you guys know very, very well. And trying to sort of a competition executive order that the White House put out last June saying all parts of government have to focus on fostering fair competition, not just the antitrust agencies. So we've made a lot of progress on that. It's not everywhere yet. Like we have a crisis, and we've just sort of maybe we've stopped the ship from moving in the wrong direction, but we're not going in the right direction yet. But that's kind of we're making a lot of progress, but there's a lot of learning that we have to do, and that policymakers have to do. And it's everywhere. I mean, it's like the airline system is screwed up, like the rail system is screwed up, like the getting medicine, the distribution, the pricing, that's all of this stuff is just messed up. It's all weird and secretive. We don't know how anything works in the government, and people who have to see and bargain with and deal with monopoly power feel alienated and isolated and like they're getting screwed, and they are. And so we have to figure out how to move the legal levers faster.
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask you a question that you kind of jogged as you were talking. So are you admitting that maybe most of Washington, D.C. doesn't know about the antitrust laws that America was really founded on and once really known for globally? In the 1920s and 30s, the Clayton Act, Sherman Act, Packers and Stockyards. We have laws on the books that should have never led us this far to where we are in the economic landscape. Do you believe that DC has basically swept that under the rug?
So they did from like the late 1970s, 1980. So not anymore is the answer to what you're saying. Like we're starting to bring it. So just to give you like a 30-second snapshot on what happened. So it wasn't that policymakers, and it wasn't just DC, it was a national thing. It wasn't that policymakers were like, oh, let's pretend that stuff never happened. It's that there were a series of intellectual movements on the left and the right that said that the point of antitrust law is not to protect the citizen, it's to protect the consumer. And it's not about addressing concentrations of power, which is how it was traditionally understood. Like concentrations of power are dangerous in a democracy. It's about promoting efficiency, right? And so economists come in and they started saying, oh, we don't have to worry about that whole rivalry power thing. That's just silly. That's antiquated. That's stuff from the 30s. Who know, whatever. That's old, right? Mm-hmm. And what we need to do is, with our fancy charts and math, do things that are efficient, right? And when a lot of small businesses and medium-sized businesses started saying, hey, this is really bad for us, and it's not good for our communities, and it's not actually good for the economy, the economists said, well, you're just inefficient. That's your problem. And you should go out of business. And I think a lot of policymakers in the 80s and 90s believed this for different reasons. And not all of them were kind of bad faith reasons. It was just sort of like, well, that's what globalization means. That's what capitalism means. That's what all of these, maybe, and you see this, I think, today as well, like, well, that's too much government, like, how dare government get involved in our markets, right? As opposed to understanding that markets are politically structured. So a lot of it was like anti-government sentiment, which I think is getting rid of rules on airlines, getting rid of rules on trains. Like, I was in a hearing like last week, and Ted Cruz said, and it's just to pick on him, I'm not making any claims about it anyway. This is just what came into my mind because this is what I saw. And there are Democrats who believe this too. So I'm not just, it's not a partisan thing, but Senator Ted Cruz said, I am going to focus on keeping big government out of the aviation industry, which, if you know anything about the aviation industry, is not coherent, because the government built the aviation industry. And I mean, it was always private industry too, but it was, from the get-go, structure the aviation industry like this is a public-private, we did it with our government, we did it with our aerospace companies, we invented the airline, we invented the airplane. And this was, it was Air Force or Army procurement. And, so to say we're going to keep big government out of the aviation industry doesn't make any sense. A lot of the airports are government owned, right? It just doesn't make sense. And that is the level of that was sort of a one level of thinking that I think a lot of policymakers really believed, because they don't, I think reasonably, like, don't necessarily trust government, right? I think a lot of, but that's the challenge here is, like, you have to manage power, and to there are private rights of action in antitrust and stuff, but to structure markets fairly, you have to actually have some sort of referee that is doing that. And so I think the anti-government sentiment from the 80s and 90s empowered the sort of these private monopolists. And so what we saw I think during the financial crisis in 2008, 9, 10, is that these institutions that I think a lot of us had come to see as just sort of apolitical, like banks and corporations, technical neutral institutions, economists made arguments about various rule setting, which came under the rubric of deregulation. Until that crash happened, it wasn't clear, I think, to a lot of people that markets and corporations and banks, how they operate is a political question. And after that happened, and you had kind of a movement that was like mostly on the left, but not dominant on the left, to break up the banks, that started to like come in, and I was part of that. And we started to say, wait a second, there are these other institutions across the economy that are too big to fail, right? That was the phrase. And this would be Google and pharmacy benefit managers and the big four meat packers and so on and so forth. And we started to notice, wait a second, the same problems that we saw in banking, of these very complex, opaque middlemen who use market power and create all sorts of fragility, that is actually the case across a lot of different markets. And so there's been some good, like, academic work and reporting, and business people have started to talk about it, and congressional investigations. And then, a bunch of conservatives have started getting interested in the problem as well. So what has happened now, the thing is to move a nation as big as America takes time, and we don't have a lot of time, is I think the problem. And so we've made a lot of progress. Like, we brought, the Trump administration brought that Google suit in 2020. They were investigating it in 2019. That suit's going to go to trial, I believe, later this year. So, like, in the fall. So this is like, what, 4 or 5 years to start investigating a monopoly to the trial, and then there's going to be an appeal. Like, that's a long time. And when you don't bring suits for 20 years, which is what happened, then you create the expectation in the business world that consolidation is fine and these coercive practices are fine. So as we bring more cases, and as members of Congress start learning more about what kind of laws to pass, it'll change. As the executive branch, the government is big, and there's a lot of people who got all their training in the last 30, 40 years. People don't change their habits immediately. They have to learn things. It is changing. It's just not changing fast enough. And I think a lot of people are really frustrated. And so they think that DC has, as you noted, like, swept this stuff under the rug. And it's like, it feels that way, but and DC, don't get me wrong, we do sweep a lot under the rug. Like, we're not, there's a lot of bad things that happen here, but like, this one is more just learning and changing bureaucracies, and like the slow work of making that happen.
Yeah.
Jaden, I actually think a question fits here really well. And so I'm just going to go ahead and ask it. You've just talked a lot about the attention that DC and the antitrust movement has had on big tech, right? And that's definitely, even out here in the Midwest, that's what we see on our news. Why is DC not focused on antitrust in the food supply chain? Why don't we hear about that?
Well, so first of all, it's not just DC. Every state has an attorney general, and
True.
every attorney general can bring cases. And there are also private rights of action, and we have not seen, and those are expensive, right? To bring a case can take a lot of, can be difficult. You might, so the USDA, okay, so under the Obama administration, let's go back like, I don't know, 10 years. So in 2008, Obama was walking around Iowa promising to do something about the packers and the processors, and then I think also Monsanto. And then they did, right? And farmers were like, are you sure you're going to do it? We're going to be retaliated against if you don't do this. And Christine Varney, who was the antitrust division chief, said, here's my cell phone number. Call me if there are any problems. And then like a year or two later, she's working at AT&T or something like that. Like, it was gross. And really, and then towards the very end of the Obama administration in 2016, they did put forward some rules around the tournament grower system in poultry farming, which is a way that poultry is much more consolidated than beef, and there are ways that the poultry processors control the farmers essentially. And so the Obama administration put some rules that were very mild. They were not good enough. They were like, okay, but they wouldn't have done that much. And then the Trump administration repealed them because I believe Sonny Perdue was, saying that this is government regulation. We don't want that. And I think there was not really a lot. I mean, there's sort of like Chuck Grassley was interested in this. The Dakota senators are sort of interested in this, but it's like there really wasn't the bureaucratic competence to move this or to understand it. And the economists were still very aggressive about saying, no, everything in agriculture is efficient. That is why it's the way it is. You cannot interfere with this super efficient market. And I think, what has happened is like increasingly no one really buys that story. But a lot of the antitrust laws, particularly the Packers and Stockyards Act, from what I understand, and I'm not an expert in this particular area, the courts have really butchered that language, have really made it hard to bring cases. And there are cases that are kind of like, I believe there are some private cases that are happening. And then my guess is the DOJ settled some stuff on poultry price fixing. And my guess is there are some investigations going on. It's not as like, you may not hear of it as much, so it may not be reported on with big tech, but it's happening. And, while there's been a lot of stuff that's happened on big tech, it's not like Google is under control, right? So like, you may not be hearing about it, but it's not like the people who have to get their stuff through the Apple App Store are like, oh yeah, sure, everything's taken care of. Like, the problems we're seeing in the big tech space or any other space they're still there, and they're still massive. And in fact, the same economists, the same judges, the same lawyers are dealing with those. And so it's kind of a question of, can we keep moving forward? Can we convince the courts? Can we convince the Republicans as they debate their 2024 primary? Like, DeSantis has done some interesting things on there. We know, Trump did some interesting things. Like, what is that debate going to look like? And I think really, it's important for people who understand these problems, who are facing these problems, to make their voices heard and say, our political leaders need to step up. And here's information about how this system really works. And that, I think that has a big impact on policymakers. Like, we do live in a democracy, and the fact that they just had, I think I'm somebody who's relatively new to the monopoly space. I've been doing it for 10 years, but I remember not knowing anything about it. Before I knew about it, I didn't realize there was this whole tradition. And I mean, I think a lot of ranchers probably did, but raising your voice really does matter, and it really does make a difference. And so I think this is a moment when, if you do that, you will find there is an openness to these ideas. It will take a while. And obviously there's an emergency in cattle markets right now. So that just sucks. But we got to do what we got to do, right?
Yep. So let's expand on kind of, as we were talking about, some cattle market stuff. And so for those our listeners that don't know, you, Matt, you wrote some articles in 2021, both of which RCAP were featured in, and I'll put those in the show notes. But those articles, one specific one I know was published following a hearing in the House Ag Committee. And in it, you discuss beef prices, consolidation, packer profits, return of the retail dollar, and, you know, on, steps forward. So what is your connection to ag? Like, what kind of piqued your interest in that antitrust facet? Because I feel like, you know, so much of the focus is on big tech that kind of the ag issues get almost a little bit swept away. Kind of like Karina was saying, swept under the rug. So what kind of got your attention, I guess?
Well, I mean, it's, you know, I don't have any kind of personal connection to agriculture. It's just always been you know, farmers and ranchers have always been fundamental parts of the anti-monopoly sentiment in America. And in lots of different ways, not just antitrust, but, you know, land. You could go back to the Northwest Ordinance in 1790s, which had very specific prescriptions on how much land any individual family should have. I mean, the idea was to make sure that that we were not a country of giant landowners, of aristocrats, that we were a country of independent people. And you can move that forward to the Homestead Act, Southern Homestead Act. And, you know, land was the original element of this because we weren't an industrialized country. And then as we move forward, you know, it was always farmers and ranchers who were at the forefront of thinking about monopolization and antitrust because they were the majority of the country. I mean, it was a rural farming country. And so, you know, as somebody like my book is about a guy named Wright Patman, who was a congressman from 1929 to 1976. He was in Texarkana, and he represented the interests of people who drilled oil wells and people who grew cotton. And it was a rural, you know, it was a rural district, and he really focused on how their constituents were getting sort of squeezed by the processors. And, you know, I was really interested in what Patman did, but it was like such a fundamental part of rural politics writ large with anti-monopolism. And that, I think, isn't there anymore. Like, you don't see those kinds of conversations in rural areas the way that you used to. And I think that it's not that people don't feel it. If you bring it up with people, they understand it. They just don't necessarily think it's political, right? It's just like the anti-monopoly sentiment has turned into anti-government sentiment, but it's the same instinct. It's that distrust of power, of concentrated power. And they, you know, people put their suspicions onto those distant, faraway masters in DC, which is fair, but they also need to maybe broaden that lens and put their skepticism on the distant masters that live in, you know, Brazil or Bentonville or wherever the giant supermarket chains or meat packers, where they're located, because that is a very dangerous collection of power, and we have to wrestle with how we're going to deal with that. So for me, I got into farming, not farming itself, but like the interest in agriculture from a historical lens, and then to see what you guys do on market structure was very, very exciting. And so, I mean, I've used a lot of your work and your data. And then what I saw in this hearing was like exactly what, you know, David Scott did the same thing in poultry like 10 years ago. And I was like, oh, that's, you know, and these economists who are screwing the cattle ranchers, they screwed the chicken farmers 10 years ago. And I was like, okay, I know how this works. It's the same people or the same type of people who work for Google, except they happen to work for Tyson's or whoever. And so it's like it's not a difficult thing to translate what is what's happening in cattle markets, what's happening in politics and like give the variant of what's going on in cattle markets. It's the same thing in every industry. I don't know the details of how to produce food, and I have tremendous respect for people who do. I do know how economists lie on behalf of big money. And so that's kind of, I was like, okay, well, I can see what's going on in this here. So let me just kind of explain why David Scott, that congressman who's, in charge of that committee, why he couldn't hear the complaints from cattle ranchers is because he has like economists in his ears. And so just like explaining that's something I can do.
Let's get a little bit more specific about that issue, because in one of your articles you talked about how Stephen Kuntz from Colorado State University maybe put a different lens on the data than what cattle producers would say the data set read to them. Talk to us about what you see economists do in the cattle industry space with data.
Yeah, so okay, so Kuhn's, let me see here. So he looked at so he was looking at captive supply agreements, and was, I think a lot of the economists, they generally like consolidation, and they look for data to prove that consolidation is good. And so what he did is that so there's a legislation, I think it's Grassley legislation, that would mandate that a certain percentage of beef is done in cash cattle markets, and so that the reference prices for captive supply agreements would reflect a real market price, as opposed to now when the cash markets are really thin and easily manipulable. You can just manipulate that market, and then the reference price gets all screwed up. So Kuntz, what he did is he looked at a very specific data set from 2003 to 2005, and said, well, that, captive supply agreements were totally fair in that period, but in 2003 to 2005 there was, the markets were fundamentally different than they are now. They were mostly cash markets. There was a lot of packer capacity, so it was much harder to manipulate prices. And then also those were the years when it was, I think, difficult to import cattle from Canada, so prices were higher. And then he's just like, well, based on the data that I've seen, everything looks great. And it's like, yeah, if from 2003 to 2005 stuff was great, like if my grandmother had wheels, she'd be a train, right? Like it's not relevant. And so he came out and like published this. And let me just read what he said. Yeah, so he just, actually, this is, he even said, he actually put a caveat at the end of his essay where he was like, yeah, I'm not really credible. It was like, extending these results to the current time period is the most questionable part of this process. Taking results from the early 2000s and interpreting them in light of market conditions in the early 2020s. But he's like, yeah, but it doesn't, yeah, there's a caveat. My study doesn't make any sense. However, it will cost consumers $16 billion based on fake numbers that I've made up. And like, that's crazy, right? That's I don't even want to say that's astrology, because that's rude to astrologists who have more integrity. And so I think like that's, and you see this with a lot of ag economists, not all of them, but you go to like these schools that have ag economics departments, and it's like the Tyson Center for the Study of Agricultural Prices. And it's like, there's a lot of expert witnesses. And I don't know what Kuntz is doing. I'm sure he believes what he's saying, but like, you have to find a way to take in the real world impacts of what's going on. And I think the USDA, they're kind of a mess, but really the problem in many cases is the courts, because the judges listen to economists, right? And so that's the struggle that we have. And I think David Scott was very confused when he saw this study, because he was like, well, I know that there's something wrong with these markets, but I'm being told there's nothing wrong with these markets, right? So you want to know, like, why would an economist say in 2012, which is what I said before, the guy was like, well, we couldn't find any monopolies, right? It's because they use methodologies like this. They're not looking for them, or I should say, they're not even not looking for them. They're looking to not find them. Right. And that is, I think, the fundamental, like, economics, these economists have blinded us to what is going on, and they blinded our policymakers. They blinded our courts. They blinded the people.
That's an excellent way to put it. Jaden, make a note. That could be the title of this podcast.
Yeah.
They are looking to not find monopolies. You just tied it back for a second to the consumer and what these policy decisions or lack of enforcement are costing the American consumer. Do you think the American consumer, the American citizen, has any idea how one note their grocery store really is? How they see the different brands of crackers or the different types of crackers, but they really don't know that the same company owns almost every cracker in the aisle. Do you think American citizens realize the issue that antitrust enforcement?
Yeah, I think they do. I don't necessarily know that they know anything about, specific markets. Like when you show that graph, it's actually everything in the supermarket is owned by 5 companies. They're all just different brands, or every toothpaste is owned by 3 companies or whatever it is. People, they love that stuff, but because it explains something they feel, right? Which is that there's a sameness to our experience of the world that didn't used to be there. Like, I just remember when I was a kid and you'd travel to different places in the country, stuff was different. You'd go you were in Florida, you had certain snacks. In Nebraska, you'd have different snacks. Now all the snacks are the same, right? You go to a rest stop and it's like the same, different, all the same candies and it's like, what happened, right? The regional varieties are gone. And there might be a bunch of, like, I remember looking at candy aisle and it was like, there was like Lifesaver gummies, and I was like, oh, that's kind of a good idea. And then I saw that like every kind of hard candy had a gummy version, and I was like, wait a second, some consultant sold the same presentation to every food conglomerate, and so they're all doing gummy versions of it. And I was like, this is a fucked up way to do things, because it's like that in every store in America right now. People know something is wrong. They saw the shortages, right, during the pandemic. They know that prices are manipulated. They don't necessarily know the specifics. They don't necessarily know that there's something they can do about it. But in the polling that we do, and my organization does polling, we do focus groups, everybody hates monopoly. And they don't mention consumerism. The word they associate with monopoly is control, right? It's a political argument. So I think one of the things that I think is a little bit difficult I think probably the most difficult thing about taking on monopolies is believing it's possible, right? So when we do polling, like 90% of people don't think monopolies are a big problem. 10% don't know. The main issue, though, is it's not that people don't want something done about them. It's that they don't think that there's any way to beat them. That's really all it is. That's like, if people feel hopeless and despondent and they feel like they're the only one who thinks the way that they're thinking, but it's not true. Like, everybody is mad about the same problem. It's just got different flavors, and they may not know they may not know the specifics of the cattle industry or whatever kind of industry you're talking about, but they get it when you sort of talk to them about it. And I think that it's a process of building a society again, right? That's so important. We don't trust each other enough to collectively come together and say, we're going to write different rules about how we run things. And because we don't have that collective trust, we aren't doing that. But part of, I think the process of building trust is a process of learning our own history or relearning our history. And I think that, we have been made to hate each other and fight each other and distrust each other. And there's lots of different ways to think or talk about that. I mean, I mentioned Ted Cruz, and my problem with what he said about airlines isn't that he's wrong. It's that it's not coherent, right? The idea of removing government from aviation doesn't make sense. We need to talk about how we run our aviation systems. And, on the other side, there was like a bunch of ticky-tacky, silly stuff too. But it's like, we have to figure out, how do we, the people, come together through our government, which we control, and structure our markets, because they are our markets, and make sure that we treat each other fairly. And that is a we problem, right? We have to have some sort of collective ability to do that, which isn't the same thing as saying, socialism. It's just about saying markets are public institutions, right? We all agree to the rules, and then some people win and some people lose, but you all have to agree on the rules. And that is, I think we've confused the idea of common agreement on the rules with sort of like a collectivism. And so instead of just writing fair rules where people can have open and fair competition, we've just said, we're not going to have any rules. We're going to allow Mark Zuckerberg to run everything, or we're going to allow JBS to run anything, or whatever it is. And then they end up writing the rules, and people get really upset, which rightfully so. But it's like, we have to rebuild politics to make this happen. So that's the challenge. It's, people do get it, right? They really do. They may not get every specific example, but I'll say this. There are a lot of staff in government that don't, like the civil staff in government in general. They have been told since the 1980s, don't upset any powerful interests because Congress will yell at you. And so they've learned not to upset any powerful interests. And that's changing. Congress is now yelling at them for not doing anything useful, but they're confused. So it's like, it's not that there's like a giant conspiracy, or maybe it is, but it's much more boring than most people think. But that's like the main problem, is you do have a lot of people who are like, well, wait a second, you've been yelling at me for 20 years to not do anything. And like, now you want me to do something? Like, I don't understand. This is really confusing, right? So that's like that's what people are just people. They're creatures of habit, right?
So how do we beat back the beast? How do we, nurture the idea of mom and pop shops? How do we come back to a center in American society where entrepreneurship is the goal? Small business owners are prioritized.
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys are doing it, right? I mean, part of it is, raise your voice and talk to policymakers, encourage your state attorneys general to investigate. I think the USDA they just put out a fund. I think they're going to say, like, so most state attorney generals, they have like 2 lawyers or something that do antitrust. Not all, some of them are bigger. The bigger states have more: Texas, California, New York. But I think the USDA is going to put out a grant program for state AGs so they can get more staff. But like, call your state AG, right? I mean, if they get 5 phone calls, that's like a significant amount of feedback. So just call your state AG or call your state legislator and ask for, and just say, I care about market power issues. This is my problem. Can you help me? And they may, it probably won't work at first, but it will work eventually, right? I mean, the thing about the corporate lobbyists is they're there every day, all the time, when people are watching and when they're not. But they're not that strong. They're just there all the time. It's like, if people start talking to their, like, what politicians care about are their voters, not because they're good people, but because that's who hires and fires them. And they don't want to get fired. And, and they also do care about, the people they represent at some level. So just make your voice heard and ask to take on monopolies, and then follow them. Like, follow the, if you follow the legislation and then you're like, why didn't you vote for that? Or why did you vote for that? Right? Like that, like a lot of times, I think this is where partisanship gets in the way is, I think if you were to ask a normal Republican, is your party taking on monopolies? They'd say, yeah. If you'd ask a normal Democrat, is your party taking on monopolies? They'd say, yeah. But like, if you look at the policies, like, they probably are or aren't in lots of different areas. And it's like, well, is your member of Congress actually voting for this particular bill that they should be voting for? Like, that's the better question than, are you taking on monopolies? Because everybody will say that. So that's kind of like, and that's good that everybody has to say that now. That's a mark of progress. But I mean, I want to give you a sense of hope, because we've made a ton of progress. Like, I know that you guys have said multiple times, well, but big tech seems to get all the press. Does anybody really care about ag? And it's like, these things are not in conflict. They're accretive, right? So it's like, if you go after Google and you say, look at what Google is doing, where they're excluding competitors from the market, they're using coercive contracts, they're doing secretive pricing around advertising, or you do it at Ticketmaster, right? Live Nation Ticketmaster. Look at all these fees they're tacking on. Look at all this ways they're keeping things secret. Look at all the side deals and coercion. It's like, it is not hard to analogize one to the other, right? And so like JBS probably looks a lot like Ticketmaster, right? It's just that it's different industry and different goods and services, but they're not that different. And so when you like, I always get this a lot, because I as surprising as it may be, somebody who hates Google will come to me and be like, why are you always focused on Amazon? And somebody who hates Amazon will be like, why are you always focused on Google? And it's like, you understand, it's all monopoly power, and the law is the law, and you can use that law effectively. It's a little bit different in ag because there are packers and stockyards, although there's all, DOJ does enforce that, but they're very similar. They analogize really well. So, going after Google helps the fight against JBS and vice versa. So I would just encourage people to raise their voice to say, yeah, this is, and the other thing is, by the way, like, everybody uses Google, right? I mean, Google matters. And also, like, going after pharmaceuticals, like PBMs and pharmaceutical firms and stuff, like, everybody needs medicine. Like, everybody eats food. Like, all of these systems do actually matter to everyone. So this is kind of like a collective endeavor. And I think we've made a lot of progress. We have a lot more to go. But I think a lot of it is like, look, there are 330 million people in America. And 10 years ago, I didn't know anything about monopoly. And now I do. There are a lot of people who don't know anything about it. It's not like they're bad people, or they've never heard of it. So like, let's do the educating, right? That is actually fundamentally how you make things happen. And you guys do that. You do a really good job. You've made a lot of progress. And I do think we are going to win here. It's just like, we just need to accelerate it.
So let's talk. I've got one last question before Jaden wraps up. So what happens if America rocks back on their heels, takes their foot off the gas on this antitrust enforcement, and just kind of says, yeah, let's see where the chips fall? Will that lead to increased fragility in our economy? And, for us, we're looking at the food supply chain.
Sorry, so if the consolidation continues, will fragility get worse, is the question?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty, so there's a law professor named Kate Judge who wrote a book called The Middleman Economy. And she worked in banking. She was a banking law specialist. And what she noticed is that the big banks are middlemen, right? They match savings and investment. And they have all these like opaque ways of doing things. And it was immensely fragile. That's what the too big to fail the crisis was. And she's like, wait a second, a lot of these other entities are also middlemen. Like JBS is a middleman, right? That's what they do. And they have the complexity and opacity in the supply chains are very similar to the banking system. And so same with the fragility. I mean, we have over 200, and that's true in every industry, like PBMs and GPO, wholesalers, and there's like tremendous consolidation. There have been over 200 generic pharmaceuticals and medical supplies in shortage. And the FDA has been keeping a list since 2012. It's just crazy shortages that we've never had before. Very simple stuff. Like, for example, medical grade salt water is in shortage, right? And this is like, that's insane. Why can't somebody mix salt water and sell it? The reason is because the middlemen that control access to hospitals will not let them charge a price that will let them profit. Does that sound familiar? Right? I mean, that's why there's a shortage. Like we saw the baby formula shortages, same thing, right? In that case, the government was the power buyer, but it's like, fragility is when you pool production and when you also pool risk. So that's what's happened. And we have fewer meat packing plants that are bigger. I mean, you guys know this better than I do, but we used to have a lot more plants that were all much smaller. Now we have a smaller group of plants that are each can do a lot more capacity. But it's like if one of those goes offline, as happens sometimes, that screws everything up. Even just in terms of shortages. I mean, without the shortage, like they have immense market power because there's only, one plant within a certain geographic area. But if the plant goes down, I mean, there was like a cyber attack, like, right, in 2020 or something. And it's like that screws up all the pricing, or I guess maybe it doesn't screw it up. It makes it really good for the remaining oligopolists because they get to charge a lot more. But that's fragility, right? I mean, the worst situation is the one we're in with beef, which is they actually, like the middlemen make money when there's a shortage. That's really bad, right? You don't want to make arson profitable. But anyway, so that's like, I think what we've seen with shortages of everything from like semiconductors to black pipe for construction to, specialized biopharmaceutical equipment to beef to toilet paper, whatever it is, we have a much more fragile economy than we used to have because of consolidation and because of bad contracting practice. I mean, another one, for example, is right to repair, right? Being unable to repair your own equipment. That is a really good way to create shortages, right? If you can't repair your equipment, then it's more likely to have shortages of that equipment because you can't repair it. That's actually the reason, I don't know if you know, but like McDonald's ice cream machines are always broken. And it's because McDonald's has prohibitions on repairing those ice cream machines from third parties can't go in and repair them.
I didn't know that.
They have
that
a special,
makes more sense.
they have a special kickback deal with like the McDonald's franchisors have a special deal with the producer of that ice cream equipment when it's apparently kind of shitty equipment. And the franchisor gets a kickback. McDonald's makes money when their franchises buy that equipment. And they make money because those franchisees have to buy like a service contract. So they can't bring a third party to like fix it or even just identify what the problems are. That's a shortage, right? Is a shortage of McDonald's ice cream. And it's artificially created through coercive contracting practices and kickbacks. A lot of this stuff is fixable. So anyway, the FTC is investigating the McDonald's ice cream shortage. It's, I think, the most popular thing I've ever done. I want that investigation to like conclude. But like, anyway, the point is this stuff is everywhere, and fragility is like a function of having a smaller and smaller group of people control everything.
So to paraphrase, especially, in the McDonald's issue and some of the other issues you just talked about was basically we sacrificed resiliency to gain a kind of proposed efficiency model.
Yeah, that's right. The efficiency, yeah, we were fooled into thinking that it was more efficient to give up one of our kidneys. You don't need two kidneys. You already have two. You already have a kidney. You don't need another one. Right?
Okay, Jaden.
Okay, so the last question we always ask guests on the podcast: what is your favorite cut of beef, and how do you like it prepared?
Oh, I probably do like a New York strip. And like what I do, I've been cooking them like low and slow. So what I'll do is like a 200 degrees in the oven for like an hour, maybe like 70 minutes, and then a quick sear.
Okay.
I mean, you gotta like salt it the night before. So I've just kind of like been enjoying that.
Love that.
But I had a burger the other day. It was really good.
That's the
It was
best.
so good. I haven't had a burger for like a long time. It was so good. I want to eat beef, but I want the profit to go to the people that do the work. right? I mean, that's the thing. It's like I bought it. I think I got the burger at like Five Guys, but I'm sure that didn't profit like the rancher, right? But it should have, right? And then look, the Packer should get some of it too. But like the that was not. I don't feel like my food dollar profited, like went to the industry, or went to the people that do the work. It obviously went to the industry.
Yep. And that's the thing is I think a lot of consumers do, like, they want to support American ag and American ranchers, and like, they have this picture in their mind of whenever they are eating beef, no matter what, they're supporting ranchers, which in a way they are, because they're driving that demand for it, but not in the way they think, I believe. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I hope the Made in America, the product of USA rulemaking is helpful. I don't know if it will be. That's not something I wanted it to happen. It's obviously not mandatory country of origin labeling.
Mm-hmm.
So we support that too, but this is something. So
yeah, it's a step in the right direction. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. At least you're not allowed to lie about whether the beef is American, which is something.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt, for joining us today and for bringing these issues to the attention of Americans. As Matt said, we need to raise up and make our voices known. So let's work together and let's work to get back to competitive markets across the board, across all industries, for the better of our country. We can't say this enough. Make sure you call that Capitol switchboard number 202-224-3121 and speak with your senators and representative today, and make sure you tell them you want to see more antitrust enforcement and more strong antitrust enforcement. With that, stay engaged in the conversation and give us a follow at RCAF on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. RCAF USA is set apart from all other national cattle associations because we rely solely on membership dues and donations to carry out our mission, which is to ensure the continued profitability and independence of United States cattle producers. We exist solely because of support from our members, and we ask you to help support RCAF USA. First year new membership dues are $50, and after that, all renewals are $100 each year. To become a member or donate, call 406-252-2516 or go to r-cafusa.com.